Anyone recognise what this film's from? He's quite young, so you might have seen the sequel more recently. It's Top Gun. There we go. It's Top Gun. It's the original Top Gun. There's a scene in the original Top Gun film where, towards the beginning, Tom Cruise's character, he plays, as you might imagine, a kind of cocky fighter pilot. He is told by one of his superior officers, "Son, your ego is writing checks your body can't cash." Your ego is writing checks your body can't cash. In other words, he is making promises that are bigger than he is, making claims for what he can deliver that are in fact beyond him. Your ego is writing checks your body can't cash. Now the trouble is, we can all do that. We live in a world where promises are much easier to make than they are to keep. It's easy to make promises that are bigger than we are. So I promise to be somewhere, and then the car breaks or there's a rail strike, and I'm unable to keep my promises because sometimes there are obstacles that are thrown up that are just too big for me. Gordon Brown, I guess for a while he looked like he had lots of power. He had an election manifesto, but when he stopped being Prime Minister, he lost most of his power to keep those promises, to deliver on them. Sometimes promises don't last. Many of us know that in our personal lives. For better, for worse, sometimes promises are too big for us. People make promises that they can't cash, promises that are in different ways too big for them. We experience that all the time. And that, I think, makes it hard to trust the promises that we hear. Certainly to trust big promises and to be willing to build our lives on them. Now, the gospel promise, the promise at the heart of the Christian faith, is, to be clear, massive. A promise that spans all of history. We've already sung about that. That is available to everyone and anyone. A promise of forgiveness and redemption, of a world made new, of bodily resurrection, of life forever with the God of life. If you're still exploring the Christian faith, let me assure you, God's promises, they are bigger and they are more wonderful than you think. But it would be reasonable to respond to them at first by thinking that promise is too big. Too big to be kept. See, if you're here this morning, you're not yet a Christian examining these promises, well, what do you need to grasp? If you're a Christian here this morning, seeking to trust and live by these promises, what do you need to grasp? To trust God's promises is people need to know He is big enough to keep them. He is big enough to keep them. And the bit of the Exodus that we're looking at this morning is going to help us with that. If you want to flip back over the page, at the end of chapter 2, we were there a couple of weeks ago, we were told God remembered his covenants, his big promise. And looking on the Israelites, looking upon his people, he was concerned for them. And last week we saw how he would show his concern, how he would keep his promise. So chapter 3, verse 8, God says, "I have come down to rescue them from the hands of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of Egypt." God has come down to rescue them from their oppression, out of the hands of the superpower of the day. It's a big promise. Will Moses and the people believe it? Would they be wise or foolish to believe it? They need to know that the Lord who makes this promise can keep it. And that's what this chapter is really all about. At this point, Moses, he needs to know who is sending him back into Egypt. If he's to play his part, if he's to trust and obey what God is asking him to do. And God's people more widely, they need to know who this God is who's sending Moses in order to trust him for the promise of rescue that he's going to offer. Let's see how God deals with each of those needs. So I guess in a sense the first problem is this: who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? That's Moses' first problem. Who am I that I should go? The opening chapters, they showed us how God can stop Pharaoh's plans to end life. We saw that with the midwives. We saw that with Moses being rescued from the river. God can stop Pharaoh's plans to end life. But Moses, he's in the wilderness because the last Pharaoh was trying to kill him. Pharaoh still appears at least to have the power of life and death in Egypt. How can Moses walk up to the king of Egypt and say, "Let my people go"? "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" says Moses, very understandably. And God answers him in verse 12. Do you see it there? "I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that I have sent you." I will be with you. I have sent you. See, that is only, it seems to me, a comfort or a help to Moses if God is greater than Pharaoh and if Moses has taken that to heart. See, if the God who says he's going to go with Moses isn't greater than Pharaoh, then having God with you as you go is not going to be much help. Nobody wants to rely on an imaginary friend when they're sitting in a disciplinary hearing. Nobody wants a comfort blanket when life gets properly hard. For God to be able to keep Moses safe and keep his promises, God needs to be bigger than Pharaoh. But even if God is greater than Pharaoh, Moses needs to know that he is. See that? Otherwise, Moses is going to refuse to trust God's promises. He won't worship God by obeying and being sent. He won't take comfort or courage from the fact that this God is with him. But if Moses knows, if he's taken to heart who it is goes with him, well, that will change everything. If Moses sees the Lord as more wonderful, as greater than Pharaoh, if he grasps that reality so that it captures his heart and mind and will, then Moses will worship and trust God, even in the face of Pharaoh's threats. Then Moses will go and speak. Just in passing, the reason why we don't worship God as his kind of greatness deserves, the reason why we struggle to obey him in different areas of our lives is because we haven't sufficiently taken to heart how great he is. Every obedience problem is at root a worship problem. We'll think about that a little bit more in our growth groups this week. But Moses here, he needs to remember, he needs to go on being gripped by the greatness of the God who sends him. And so to help him with that, God gives him a sign. Verse 12, "This will be a sign to you," he says. Now, scholars disagree a bit about what the sign might be. Is it the burning bush that he's just seen, or is it what comes next in the sentence, the people being brought out of Egypt to worship on the same mountain? I think it's the burning bush. Okay, I think the sign is the burning bush, and if you want to talk about that some more, we can talk about that afterwards or during the week. But I think the purpose of the sign is to give Moses comfort and courage as he is sent. He needs to know that he's sent by the God of the burning bush, the God who needs nothing and so can rescue the needy, the God who is the Holy One who can rescue unholy people, what we were thinking about last week. So the end of verse 12 is really just a promise, a reminder that God guarantees the results. To take up God's call, to worship and obey, means grasping who has sent you and who goes with you. That's what we're being shown. Now, we've talked before, Jesus is the greater Moses, the ultimate rescuer. It's no surprise then that in the Gospels, Jesus knows and is gripped by who has sent him. In John's Gospel, it's clear Jesus understands he's doing the work of the Father in the power of the Spirit. Jesus is never acting on his own. When God the Son comes down to rescue, he comes down as the sent one, and the Father and the Spirit are always with him. That's how Jesus can go to Jerusalem towards the rulers and authorities who appear to have the power of life and death, the people who he knows want to kill him. Jesus can go to his trial, he can go to the cross because he knows the one who has sent him. He knows he's not alone. Jesus is the greater Moses. But it's worth saying, as we read through Exodus, we aren't Moses. If we want to find ourselves anywhere in this story, then we're either the ordinary Israelites or we're the ordinary Egyptians. Moses points us to Jesus before he is an example for us. But we do get a pattern here for how God sends people, which I think also applies to us. God never says, go and do it on your own. He will never say that to you. He always says, I have sent you and I will be with you. That is the pattern. That's the pattern when Jesus sends his disciples. The end of Matthew's Gospel. Jesus sending his disciples out into the world. What does he say? All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Jesus wants us to know and to grasp who it is who is sending us. The one who has all authority. The one who is greater and more wonderful than any human authority. The Lord who has all authority is the one who sends you. What else does Jesus say? Surely I am with you always, to the very ends of the age. Jesus is with every Christian through the Holy Spirit who never acts alone. What does that mean for us? It means when we think our workplace or our classrooms or our neighbours' houses feel like Pharaoh's palace. And when we think to ourselves, who am I to speak to them? Who am I that I should go to them? Hear this answer from Jesus. I will be with you. It is I who have sent you. See, allow your mind, your heart, your will to be gripped by that reality. God is greater than everyone and anyone he will ever send you to speak to. Let's pick things up, verse 13. See, remember, Pharaoh isn't the only challenge that Moses is going to face. There's also the Israelites themselves. Will the Israelites know who sent Moses? Will they listen? And that is where Moses' mind goes next, it seems. So verse 13, if we pick it up together, Moses asked God, suppose I go to the Israelites and I say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, what is his name? What shall I tell them? The Israelites, they need to know who has sent Moses if they're to come to know him for themselves, if they are to trust what they hear and worship God in response. And what follows then is this amazing conversation, which I hope will just help us to know the Lord better, the God of Abraham, the God of the Exodus, the God of Easter. So we'll follow through quite quickly. Just notice how the conversation develops as God gives and then explains his name. God begins, verse 14, by answering Moses, I am who I am. Because of how Hebrew works, that can also mean I will be who I will be. And then God says a bit more. This is what yours to say to the Israelites, I am has sent you. And then he develops it a bit further. So verse 15, God said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, has sent me to you. Wherever you see, you may know this already, it may be new to you, wherever you see the Lord in capital letters in the Old Testament, that is standing in for the Hebrew word Yahweh. It's the name that God gives himself here, and it has its roots in the Hebrew verb to be. Okay? So God, in giving himself this name, Yahweh, is sharing a name that somehow expresses and summarizes who he is in his being. I am who I am. And because of that, you are to call me this name Yahweh, which connects to that idea of being, I am who I am, I will be who I will be. Now, why is it good news that God is like that? Let me suggest two. I am who I am means the Lord is most real. If I can put it like that. The Lord is most real. The God who introduces himself in the Bible doesn't depend on anyone or anything. The Lord simply is, always has been, always will be. He existed before he made anything, and he is more real than anything that he has made. He simply is. The Lord exists whether you and I believe in him or not. Pharaoh will later say, when Moses does go and speak to him, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord." But it won't matter. The Lord, whom Pharaoh doesn't know, will still turn Pharaoh's world upside down. Reality is like that. It doesn't change to fit with what you or I believe, what we think we know. Any more than gravity only applies to those who believe in it. Gravity simply is. Reality is like that, isn't it? There are things about it we just can't escape. We can't change. And God, the great I Am, is ultimate reality. He is most real, whether we believe it or not. And the Israelites, they need to know that. The power of Egypt would have seemed so real to them. Its wealth and its technology so glorious. Pharaoh could presumably stand up in front of the crowds and say, "I am Pharaoh," and they would cheer, and the pyramids of Giza would stand there, and everyone would go, "Wow, this will last, this is amazing. Who can compare with Pharaoh?" And into that culture, into that sort of a way of seeing the world, why would you trust Moses over the words of the great Pharaoh? Why wouldn't you trust in everything that the Egyptians worshipped? Because, as we'll see, God will stretch out his hand and roll it all up and wash it all away. See, this is the God who promises to rescue them. He is most real. What about us? Well, what do we consider to be most real in our lives? It'll be different for all of us, but it will be shown by what we live for. It will shape what you trust. It will determine who or what you worship. That's why it matters that we see reality clearly as it really is. What is true of ancient Egypt is true of all creation. In the beginning, the Lord laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of his hands. The psalmist says, "You will roll them up like a robe, but you will remain the same, and your years will never end." The Lord is most real. He doesn't depend on anyone else. Everything else depends on him. So he stands astride creation and says, "I am who I am." See, that means there is no promise that is too big for him to catch. I mentioned too, because of the way that Hebrew works, this description that God gives himself in verse 14 can also mean, "I will be who I will be." Something else we can remember every time we see the Lord written in capitals in our Bibles. He is, if you like, most free. The Lord will be who he will be. He's free to act in line with his character and his heart in all that he does. There is no limit outside of him that can constrain him or limit him. Just follows from who God is as creator. Nothing he has made can force his hand, any more than Voldemort can force J.K. Rowling to do something. The creatures can't force the hand of the creator, which means you can't stop him. There's nothing that you can do that will make him change his mind. That's why he can announce the future before it happens. Because he wills it, it's as good as already happened. The Lord speaks into creation and he says, "I will be who I will be." Now, as we finish, God speaks about his being. "I am who I am, I will be who I will be," to explain and introduce his name. So verse 15, God also said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you." Why does he wrap all of that together? I think the point here is that the God who makes promises to Abraham's extended family is the Lord, who is most real and most free. When we hear the promise, we're to remember what the promise maker is like. He is big enough to be a promise keeper. Does that make sense? That's what's happened. When we hear at the words that follow next, verse 17, I have promised to bring you up out of your misery in Egypt into a land flowing with milk and honey, in fulfillment of the promise that I've made to Abraham. The emphasis in all of this falls on I. I have promised. Abraham's extended family can trust and act on these promises because it is the I, the Lord, who has made them. He's more real than Pharaoh. He's free to do as he pleases within his creation. So when the Lord strikes the Egyptians with signs and wonders, they're to know it is the Lord who is rescuing them. He isn't one God amongst many of the long list of Egyptian gods. He isn't God of one people or one geography. He's the Lord. He's come down to rescue them. And so their future is certain. When he says he will gather them to worship on the mountain, it's as good as happened, because God has said he'll do it. See, big promises, they require a big promise keeper. God reveals his name and his being so that his people can know the Lord is big enough to deliver on the promises that he makes to them. His people can cash every check that he writes. Now, we need to know that Abraham's family goes global, as it were, with the coming of Jesus. If you're trusting Jesus this morning, you are an inheritor of God's promises to Abraham, expanded and fulfilled in Jesus. If you aren't trusting Jesus, perhaps you think the promises are too big, too good to be possible. Forgiveness for every wrong you've ever done. That Jesus, the perfect God-man, could come and grant you true freedom, share with you all his royal privileges. That he should grant life with him and one day put the world right, overcome all evil, make all things new, raise you from the dead, enjoy life with him forever. Maybe you hear these promises and you think, it can't be real. You need to know this promise is spoken by the God who is most real. The one who makes and defines reality. And maybe you hear these promises, you think they're simply too big to be kept. You need to know this promise is spoken by the God who is most free. Nobody and nothing can stop him from keeping any and every promise that he makes. See the problem, when we separate the promises from the God who makes them, we'll start to get into trouble. We'll start to doubt the promise, because on the lips of anybody else, they would be too big and too wonderful. Only the Lord is big enough to keep the promises that he makes. His infinite glory and goodness mean when he writes a check, it can always be cashed. Now here's the thing as we finish. I know many of us are sitting here thinking, I know this already. I know that God can do anything. I know that all his promises to me are good. I know that the Lord can keep them all. Just imagine for a moment what it would be like for somebody to be completely gripped by that reality, to have taken that fully to heart, as it were. We would trust God completely, wouldn't we? We would seek out and delight in his promises, because they would be our solid ground in a sea of words that you can't trust. We'd pore over them. We'd feed our souls with them. We'd comfort others with them. If we grasp that fully, well, then there would be nothing God couldn't ask of us. There'd be no command that we wouldn't delight to obey, whatever worldly obstacles were presented in front of us, because we would trust the goodness and the power of the Lord who was with us. If we'd taken fully to heart that the Lord was like this, we'd never feel anxious. We'd know that God had dealt with our past, guaranteed our future, and was with us in the present. The list goes on. If we knew that the Lord was like this, if we'd taken this to heart, well, then we'd have hearts like Jesus. We'd have joy like Jesus. We would live lives like and for Jesus. Now, those of us here who are Christians, we've begun to taste something of that joy, that freedom, that peace. We live that life of worship and obedience in part, haven't we? And it's wonderful. But we've all got progress that we can make in taking this to heart. Because every Christian here has things God says that we don't trust. We wouldn't maybe say it like that, but that we don't live like Jesus reveals it to be true. There are promises that God makes that we don't rest in. For some of them, we don't put enough stock by them to even explore them or enjoy them particularly. There are calls to trust and obey God that we think are impossible for us. Places we won't go, people we won't speak to. We need to grasp who it is who is sending us and who goes with us into the world. There are calls to holiness that we simply don't like. Parts of our lives where we trust promises made by other voices. There are areas of life where we're dazzled by something less real than the Lord, where we're seeking joy and giving worship to lesser created things instead of Him. We need to grasp that the Lord is the great I am. That's the answer. To grasp who the Lord is who makes these gospel promises to you. Since life enjoyed with God is the best part of the gospel promise, taking to heart who He is will make the promises themselves bigger and more wonderful. It's life with Him. And crucially, grasping the Lord is most real, most free. That will help us to know that the Lord is big enough to keep those promises as well.